Good morning. My name is Pastor Chad. I'm the youth pastor here. If you don't know me, I also want to thank Danette and her husband Jonathan for, well, first of all, that impassioned plea to have us partner together as a church for our teens, which I'm obviously very passionate about as well. So do please, after the service, check out that board. In fact, I think we should just keep it up. It looks excellent. It looks like a piece of art out there. So please do check that out after the service. Now, speaking of challenge, I've been to challenge before as a leader. It was excellent. It's been a number of years, so I'm excited to go back. And I've been on a few other types of conferences and retreats like maybe you have. And as great and as important and as formative as they are, there's a phenomenon that's kind of the elephant in the room when it comes to a conference or a retreat that we need to talk about, which is the spiritual high, right? So how it works, for example, at Impact, which the senior hires and I went on this past January, it was just a pretty short weekend, but they have a number of talks, and it has a theme, and they kind of build up to this big night, right? It's this big night where it tends to be more emotional, and the gospel gets presented, and people are asked to commit their lives or recommit their lives to Christ. And, at this time at Impact this last year, there was even some confession among the people there, among the students, and forgiveness being extended. And it was this amazing moment. And it could rightly be described as a high. That's not to denigrate what was going on there. God was moving, and it gave us kind of a spiritual high. And the speaker, he actually drew attention to this spiritual high because he speaks at a number of conferences. And he had warned us that, yes, you get home and that can wear off. But he actually said, you know what? Typically, we think of the spiritual high as wearing off and fizzling when we get back and kind of get back into the daily grind of school or work. But he said, you know what you're going to find is the high is probably going to wear off tomorrow morning before we've even left the conference yet. Because even though we've just had this great night of worship, all of a sudden the alarm clock goes off. How many of you here are super cheerful when that alarm clock goes off? I should see very few hands, if any, right? Morning doesn't bring the best out of us. Tiredness is like one of our biggest excuses for being jerks, isn't it? And that's no different even at a conference because your bedmate was hogging the covers and your other roommate was snoring and your other roommate is taking twice as long of a shower as he said that he would. I was that roommate, actually. Sorry, guys, that I roomed with. And you find that we almost have like this amnesia, this short-term memory loss, this high that we had, it wears off. Now, I have to say that at Impact, yes, there's probably for a lot of us, like we didn't wake up feeling like this high like we'd felt the night before, but I think we did one better than have it wear off in the morning. I think it wore off like 5 minutes after we left the room. You know why? Because we exited that worship space into a dodgeball tournament. And what better way to exercise Christian charity and love and kindness than some good old friendly dodgeball, throwing balls in the face kind of competition. No, it didn't take very long, and I was kind of amazed, actually, that, all of us together just had this amazing experience, and it didn't take long for us to resort back to our old ways of, playing dodgeball. It's always the other team that's cheating, right? Not your own team. And you start calling them out. And I wasn't immune to this. I started getting a little angsty when I started seeing things that I felt like were cheating going on. And there's even this one youth leader at this church who, no, it's not good to bash other youth leaders, but he was calling other kids idiots in this group. And we were kind of scratching our heads what's going on here? It wore off very quickly. Now, this isn't just for teens at Impact or Challenge. If you've been to any conference or retreat, you may have experienced something very similar. And maybe it's when you get back home and you even know that there's this spiritual high and that you don't want it to wear off, but then you get into the daily grind and you recognize that maybe you felt like you changed at the conference, but the rest of the world didn't. And so you kind of slip back into a lot of your old ways, if not all of them. Or just on a different level, let's just talk about all of us here this morning. If you come to church weekly, week in and week out, some weeks it's like you leave and you're like, oh man, the Spirit was was moving as we worshiped. It was probably moving through April, most likely, and channeling out through her. And I always appreciate that about you, April. I feel like it's contagious. And the Spirit moves, and then Pastor Kevin, he preaches the word, and maybe you feel conviction for your sin or comfort in your affliction, and God was here and in this place among us. And yeah, sometimes, it wears off Monday morning. Sometimes it wears off like on the car ride home, right? Like when your kids are in the car or you're disagreeing about something with your spouse. I'm not immune to that either. So what do we do with this phenomenon? Let's put it this way, what do we call our normal, trouble-filled, mundane life that we go back to after having a genuine experience of salvation? And by the way, when I talk about salvation today, it's not just looking at something in the future or your conversion, but thinking of any time that God moves as a way for you to experience God saving you, your salvation. What do we call that space in life where the spiritual high wears off and we're just back to normal life with all of its troubles and trials? Well, that, folks, is called the wilderness. And if you turn in Exodus with me now to where we were last week, in chapter 15, we saw that Israel was on a major spiritual high after having a real, genuine experience of God's salvation. God had just performed the Exodus on their behalf, and they explode in a song of praise and thanksgiving and gratitude. But then Israel's high wears off as their salvation from Egypt brings them to life in the wilderness. And the narrative now takes a very sharp turn from that praise to the wilderness and the grumbling in the wilderness. Paul says in the New Testament that these events in the wilderness that Israel goes through, some of them that we're going to see today, he says that these things took place as examples for us, that we might not desire evil as they did. That's from 1 Corinthians. In saying this, Paul wants us to recognize in the church's life something that is common to Israel's life, and that's the reality of the wilderness. And so this morning we're going to be moving back and forth between Israel back then and the church, us now, and we're still all the people of God. And we're going to look at this reality of the wilderness. So first of all, what is the wilderness? Well, it's two things. It's a place, it's a literal place, and it's also a symbolic kind of place. It's a symbol that gets used. So first of all, it's a place. For Israel, it is a real, literal flesh and blood place. An arid land that was deserted and desolate. And it was this kind of place before it was ever symbolic. It's a place without much food or water, which means for them, it puts them in survival mode. So if you're in the wilderness, well, first of all, it's not like a really good place to plant, right? You're just trying to get through there and get through there quickly and not die because there's not a lot of food or water there to sustain you, let alone a massive group of people like Israel. Now, for us, we have like Hy-Vee and Aldi and Fairway like right down the street. So it's kind of hard for us to really take a walk in Israel's shoes. But just try to imagine what would happen if today Hy-Vee, Aldi, and Fairway, they all set up. We have no more food. What's on the shelves is all there is. How long do you think it would take for us as a people to go crazy? I'd give us maybe like 3 days, right? Before we'd start looting and treating each other really horribly, very concerned about our own self-preservation. It would be kind of a recipe for disaster, am I right? So that's kind of the situation that Israel is in the wilderness. But the wilderness is not just a place, it's also a symbol. So it doesn't just have, so it's a place and it has geographic boundaries, right? So for Israel, that was the Sinai Peninsula, which was between Egypt, which was a civilization, and then the Promised Land, Canaan, which was not the wilderness. It was a land flowing with milk and honey. So there were geographic boundaries, and that's also the same with the wilderness as a symbol. It also has boundaries that are symbolic, and you'll see in your bulletin, I have a quote there. It's from a commentator named Terence Fretheim. He says, "Wilderness is life beyond redemption but short of consummation. So he's showing us the boundaries of wilderness as a symbol. So let's unpack that a little bit. The boundaries to the story of Israel's life in the wilderness. It's not just a literal place, but the wilderness symbolizes this place where it's after they've been redeemed from Egypt. So we've had the Exodus, and now they're in the wilderness, and they stay in the wilderness until they get into the promised land. So another way of putting that is that wilderness is the boundary between God starting to save them and when he will have fully saved them. There will be that culmination of salvation in the promised land. And the wilderness is just that space in between. And just so you get an idea of how significant of a chapter this is in Israel's story, so the first 5 books of the Bible are a unity. They're called the Pentateuch or the Torah. So we're talking about Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. 2/3 of all those 5 books together takes place in the wilderness. So actually, up until this point, Genesis through halfway about through Exodus, not in the wilderness. Now from Exodus all the way through the end of Exodus and the next couple books, wilderness. This is a significant chapter in Israel's history. Now, switching from Israel to the church, I want to define for us what our wilderness is. And for us, it's not a literal wilderness, right? We are in civilization. So ours really is the kind of symbolic kind of wilderness. And it has similar boundaries as Israel's wilderness, but they're not geographic. So we might say this, that the church's wilderness is life beyond our redemption on the cross, but short of our entrance into heaven, which is our promised land in the future. So what that we could also think of it as between Christ's first coming and second coming. We have the first coming, which is where Christ really does defeat sin and death, but they're still present until he comes back. And so this space in between that we've lived in as the church for 2,000 years, we could rightfully call wilderness, where God has saved us and we can experience that salvation. But it's the kind of place where we have amnesia and it wears off because there are trials and troubles until that day that's coming where they will be no more and there will be no more wilderness. Now this morning we're going to heed Paul's wisdom and seek to be instructed through Israel's bad example in the wilderness so that we can live faithfully in the church's wilderness. So most of the time when we think of these stories, if you're familiar with Israel in the wilderness, we focus on the bad news of what happens in the wilderness, which is, tisk, tisk, there goes Israel grumbling and grumbling after God has saved them and saved them. And this bad news of the wilderness is true, and it's worth probing and learning from, but it's really not the whole story of the wilderness, for there's actually a lot of good news in the wilderness that we're going to see. And it's good news that we need to know if we're to have a hope of living faithfully in our wilderness today. So here's the short of it. There's good news in the wilderness because God is in the wilderness. So actually this bad news, good news thing here is actually the pattern of our long passage today. The pattern is this. It's just simply Israel grumbles and yet God provides, and rinse and repeat, right? So the sketch of the passage, if you're looking at it, is we start in chapter 15, verse 22, and we're going to go through chapter 17, verse 7. And there's 3 stories in this one long passage that all go together. We have Israel's thirst at a place called Marah. That takes us to the end of chapter 15. And then chapter 16, we have Israel's hunger in the wilderness of sin. And then thirdly, we have Israel's thirst, yet again, but at a place called Rephidim. And that's just the beginning of chapter 17. Now don't worry, we're not going to be reading through or looking through the details of all of that, but we'll be looking for what's important here. And again, in all 3 of these stories, we see this pattern of Israel grumbling and yet God providing. And so we're going to go sketch each of these stories, and in doing so, we're going to first look at the good news of God in the wilderness for Israel and then also for us as the church. So read with me here. So we're actually going to read most of this first story because it's very short. So chapter 15, verse 22. Again, this is right on the heels of them praising God, and then the narrative just takes this drastically sharp turn. Verse 22, Then Moses made Israel set out from the Red Sea, and they went into the wilderness of Shur. They went 3 days in the wilderness and found no water. Uh-oh. When they came to Marah, they could not drink the water of Marah because it was bitter. Therefore, it was named Marah, which means bitter. And the people grumbled against Moses, saying, "What shall we drink?" And he cried to the Lord, and the Lord showed him a log, and he threw it into the water, and the water became sweet. Now, we'll talk a little bit more at length about the sin of grumbling later, but all we have to see for now is that they've committed it, and it is a great sin, and it's a sin against God. What I want to focus on first is God in the wilderness and looking at God's response to their grumbling. And notably, it's not one of anger. So if they have sinned here, which they have, then we might expect God to be angry. He has every right to be angry, but he isn't. There actually isn't a trace of anger that we can see here on this page. It's actually God providing. And it's not for just this story, it's for all three stories we're going to encounter here. There's an abundance of God's provision for his people and a notable absence of his anger. And the Old Testament later well remembers God's provision during Israel's wilderness journey here. So, for example, in Hosea, this is what God says. When Israel was a child, I, God, loved him. And out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. Yet it was I who taught Israel to walk. I took them up by their arms, but they did not know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love. And I became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jaws, and I bent down to them and fed them. We see this tender language here that Hosea looks back on this time of Israel in the wilderness and sees God treating Israel as a beloved son. God's provision for Israel in these three stories is a mark of his deep love for his people. Now, that Israel even had a need for water in the first place does raise a question which we'll address later, why they would even have that need if God really does care for them. But for now, let's talk about what it means that God met that need. And this is the first point in your bulletin to fill in here. God provides for his people what they actually need. So again, we're looking at the context of the wilderness. And in that context, God provides for his people what they actually need. Now, I'm very careful with Hello? Hello. That'll do for now. So I was choosing my words carefully there with actually need. Notice it doesn't say that God provides people what they want, right? Because what we want is not always what we need. In fact, sometimes they're diametrically opposed. But I also said actually need because sometimes we think we need something. We don't think of it as a want, but we think of it as a need. It's a perceived need that we have. And yet it's actually not what we actually need. Thank you, Josh. In fact, God is the only one who truly knows what we actually need. And so Moses recounts God's wilderness provision and how God provided what they actually needed. This is in Deuteronomy, so Moses is looking back to this time from a later place. He says to Israel, God fed you, Israel, with manna. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Hello? Hey, thank you, Josh. Round of applause. I'm blaming Dennis, by the way, because he used my mic pack the other day. So, thanks, Dennis. I'll just read that again. This is from Deuteronomy again. This is Moses recounting God's wilderness provision. God fed you, Israel, with manna. Your clothing did not wear out on you, and your foot did not swell these 40 years. Not just this one time, but these 40 years in the wilderness. God gave them consistent provisions for their survival. You see, God God, his stated plan for Israel all along was to fulfill his covenant way back with Abraham by bringing the people Israel into the promised land, alive, presumably, right? Which means that they would need food to get there in the wilderness. Now, Israel could have put two and two together to realize that this same God, the same one who made this covenant, wouldn't allow them to die of thirst and starvation in the wilderness. But they don't realize this, unfortunately. But God, he did not let them starve. He made provision for them for all 40 years, not just here, not just in these three stories, but for the 40 years that they were in the wilderness. In fact, when we see when we finish this story in verse 27 that God seemed to have intended all along to provide for Israel at this beginning leg of their journey. Read with me in verse 27. So they're moving here after God has made the bitter water sweet for them to drink. It says, then they came to Elim. So now they're at the next place where God's led them, where there were 12 springs of water and 70 palm trees, and they encamped there by the water. Isn't it interesting that the very next place that they go, that God was leading them, had all that they needed to cure their thirst? In fact, it says 12 springs of water. Kind of might be a hint by the author that, so there's 12 tribes of Israel, so there's a spring for every tribe, which is a way of saying that God provided water for everyone at this oasis that he led them to. The very next place. You imagine that maybe Israel should have just trusted God and he was going to lead them where they needed to go, but they didn't, unfortunately, and yet he still provided. But what about us, the church in wilderness today? I mean, water or bread or manna is hardly our greatest need. But we do have needs, right? Well, John, in his gospel, weaves in a number of connections very masterfully to these very wilderness stories to show that Jesus is a new, better kind of manna and water for God's people. So here's a couple excerpts from John 6 where Jesus is speaking. Here's the short form of it. This is what Jesus says. He says, do not labor for the food that perishes, but for the food that endures to eternal life. So there's two different kinds of food, one that perishes and one that will bring you to eternal life, which the Son of Man will give to you. So it's being offered. But Jesus goes on to explain what this bread is, this special bread. He says, I am the bread of life. Whoever comes to me shall not hunger. Whoever believes in me shall never thirst. Your fathers, Israel here, ate the manna in the wilderness and they died. But by contrast, I am the living bread that came down from heaven. This is the bread that came down from heaven, not as the fathers ate and died. Whoever feeds on this bread will live forever. And shortly after, John describes how Jesus provides drink to anyone who thirsts. And John explains that this living water that Jesus provides is, in fact, the Holy Spirit. And so together we see that the provision that God has given to his church in their deepest need in their wilderness is nothing less than himself, the Son and the Spirit. And all we have to do is respond to that invitation to come and eat this bread of life, to come and drink this living water, to feast, if you will, on Christ. What does this look like, though, like in life? I was trying to think of some things that very much characterize wilderness or symbolize wilderness for me. I thought of cancer. Is cancer a wilderness? Absolutely. I can't even really imagine, but no doubt that cancer is a wilderness where one is made to feel a deep spiritual hunger and thirst. But if Christ has offered you nothing less than himself, we're talking about God here, the infinite. If God has offered you nothing less than himself for your deepest hungers and thirsts, then you can be filled, even if you can't be healed yet. God has offered to meet your deepest need in your wilderness. Or another example is losing a loved one, a wilderness. I think it's one of the worst kinds of wilderness we're made to wander through in this life. And the longer we live, the more times we're made to wander through it, hungry and thirsty, sometimes feeling as though we may never feel full or quenched again, but dry until we die ourselves. But if Christ really has offered you nothing less than himself for your deepest hungers and thirst, then you can be filled, even if you can't bring your loved one back from the dead yet. When we believe in him, in Jesus, in the truest sense, we are as fed as we truly and actually need to be. And so it's true for all God's people then and now that God provides for his people with what they actually need in their wilderness. Now, I had mentioned before briefly that it's peculiar that Israel even had a need in the first place for food and water, especially seeing that it's pretty clear that God, his will has been to provide for his people to fulfill their needs. So now we have to explain the fact that God permitted Israel to experience hunger and thirst at all. Why would he permit that? Well, we'll see in our second story here, and it's all of chapter 16, and we're not going to read it. We're just going to touch on a verse here or there, but here's the short story of it. It's that Israel travels again, now to the wilderness of sin. Don't think a lot about that word. Don't make too much of it, because it's just a transliteration of a Hebrew word that just has the sound. It sounds like sin, so it doesn't have the meaning of our word for sin there. So they travel to the wilderness of sin, and guess what? They grumble again now, but about the lack of food. And they complain about how, they had food in Egypt, and would that God would have killed them in Egypt when they at least had full bellies, as opposed to in the wilderness to die with empty stomachs. And how does God respond? Well, not with anger, but again with provision. And God actually sets a plan into motion, not just to provide for them food this once, but for the rest of their time in the wilderness. He puts a plan into motion, a food program, if you will, that will sustain them throughout their wilderness journey. And here's basically what it is God says, I'm going to provide manna for you daily. But here's the catch. Israel is to live almost like paycheck to paycheck, but manna to manna. In other words, God wants them to get by just on their daily bread. No more, no less. You will get manna for the day, and you don't get to freeze it, and then, eat it for the next 6 months if you gather a bunch in one day. But God says, you get enough for the day, and that's it. By the end of the day, you will have nothing, and you will depend on me once again the next day for your provision. Now, God introduces this daily bread food program by stating his purpose behind it. And we see this in chapter 16, verse 4. So it says, Then the Lord said to Moses, Behold, I am about to rain bread from heaven for you, and the people shall go out and gather a day's portion every day. This is a purpose statement here, that I may test them, whether they will walk in my law or not. God says here that his daily bread food program for Israel is not only a cure for Israel's hunger. That's part of it, obviously, but it also functions as a test to prepare his people to receive his law, which is coming up in just a couple chapters. So in other words, God is preparing Israel to trust and obey his voice now, so that they will be able to trust and obey his voice later when he gives his law. It's pretty simple. So God really isn't being cruel or stingy by allowing Israel to only have their daily bread and no more. Rather, God has put a tight rein on his provisions so that they can learn to trust that he will always, that means daily, provide for him or for them. And so we know this now about God in the wilderness, and it's the next slide here. God withholds from his people, this is a hard truth, but it's a good one at the end of the day. God withholds from his people in order to grow their trust in him. Now, remember that God plans to give Israel an overabundance in the promised land of food, but they're not ready for that overabundance yet. And yet God knows that Israel needs to experience fully their complete dependence on him in the wilderness so that they can learn to trust him completely. And so here's where we finally have the answer to our burning question, or at least my burning question, as to why God allowed Israel to experience this thirst and hunger in the first place. It's this, it's that God withholds in order to help his people recognize their complete dependence on him and so grow their trust in him, who is completely dependable. Now in Deuteronomy, Moses recounts, he looks back and he says explicitly why God permitted both Israel's wilderness hunger and his provision of manna. It says this, "The Lord your God has led you these 40 years in the wilderness so that he might humble you. And he humbled you, and he let you hunger, and he fed you with manna that he might make you know that man does not live by bread alone, but man lives by every word that comes from the mouth of God." In other words, God permitted Israel's hunger and their whole wilderness experience in general so that they would know who it is that they are totally dependent on. And there's just no getting around this conclusion that God permits life in the wilderness for Israel as well as for us, because wilderness is fertile ground, if for nothing else than for growing our trust in him. So to sum up what we've seen so far, we see that it's good news that God is with the church in our wilderness, both in what he gives us and provides to us. That's good news. And in particular, he gives us the bread of life and the living water, Son and Holy Spirit. But it's even good news what he withholds from us, because it's for our greater good. And so now we'll turn to the third story, where we'll see the good news of the wilderness gets even better, even as the bad news of Israel's grumbling rebellion gets worse. So we'll just read this here because it's pretty short. Chapter 17, verses 1 through 7. So this is our third story. "All the congregation of the people of Israel moved on from the wilderness of sin by stages, according to the commandment of the Lord, and camped at Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink." Therefore the people quarreled with Moses and said, "Give us water to drink." And Moses said, "Why do you quarrel with me? Why do you test the Lord?" But the people thirsted there for water, and the people grumbled against Moses and said, "Why did you bring us up out of Egypt? To kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst?" So Moses cried to the Lord, "What shall I do with this people? They're almost ready to stone me." And the Lord said to Moses, "Pass on before the people, taking with you some of the elders of Israel, and take in your hand the staff with which you struck the Nile, and go. Behold, I will stand before you there on the rock at Horeb, and you shall strike the rock, and water shall come out of it, and the people will drink." And Moses did so in the sight of the elders of Israel, and he called the name of that place Massah and Meribah because of the quarreling of the people of Israel, and because they tested the Lord by saying, "Is the Lord among us or not?" So shall we count the ways in which Israel's sin has just escalated and got much worse? Now they're quarreling with Moses, not just grumbling, but quarreling. And Moses says that this actually amounts to them not just testing him, but testing God, which is interesting because who was doing the testing before? In both stories before, God was testing his people. But now Israel is testing God. The test-e now presumes to become the test-er, if you will. They're flipping it around. And to make matters worse, they accuse Moses and God of murder. They accuse them of bringing them out of Egypt just to kill them. And they also threaten capital punishment, which is the stoning that Moses thinks that Israel is going to do to him. And lastly, in that last verse, we see that they completely just lack trust in God. They question whether the Lord is among them or not, even though the previous two stories make it clear that God is with them and providing for them. It's no wonder that this very event is referred to later in the Old Testament a number of times with disdain. It's a stain on Israel's history. And yet, though the bad news of Israel's sin has escalated, God has matched their sin with his grace because he gives them water. And here's where we see the third piece of good news about how God works in the wilderness for his people. God provides for his people even when they don't deserve it. It's just right on the page there. They don't deserve it, and yet they get what they don't deserve. And now for the church in the wilderness, for us, remember that our redemption from sin was granted to us when we were undeserving of it. It's like Romans 5:8 says, while we were still sinners, Christ died for us when we were undeserving. And so it shouldn't be a surprise for us that God's provision for us in the wilderness is granted to us when we don't deserve it now either. And the word for this unmerited favor, is just grace. And that's what we're seeing right here. But the most striking truth we see in this passage, if you haven't seen it yet, is this, and it's the fourth piece of good news about God in the wilderness. God provides for his people at his own expense. I don't know if you caught this, but did you catch who was standing on the rock that Moses struck? It was God. God said he would stand on the rock. Now, I don't know what that looked like, but he was there. And I'll spare you the details, but it's very clear because of the language and imagery that's being used is that the ancient reader would have understood that this is like a courtroom scene. And in a courtroom, we normally think of God as the judge, right? And his people who are sinful as the ones in the dock. But it's flipped around here because Israel accuses God, and they put God in the dock, and they usurp his seat of judgment and assume to be the judge. And what's more astounding than that is that God lets it happen. God submits himself to being in the dock to be judged by his people. And we know this in particular because God tells Moses to take this staff, right? And what has this staff been used for over and over again in Exodus? It's been used to judge Egypt. And so God is saying, take that same staff and strike the rock with it, the rock that God is standing on. And so God, it's a symbolic act where God is accepting an unjust judgment. He is providing for his people at the expense of himself. It's probably no mystery how this connects to the church in the wilderness, that God once and for all provided for his people at his own expense of his Son, himself. There's plenty of good news in the wilderness, but there's just a little bit of bad news in the wilderness. And, Israel, their grumbling is ridiculous enough in these three stories, but especially when we remember where they just come from. They had just been saved. They had just witnessed the most climactic event probably in world history up to this point, this great act of salvation like the world had never seen before. That was right before the wilderness, and now that they are grumbling. And the sin of grumbling, it really amounts to a mistrust. And so this is the bad news of the wilderness. It's that God's people often mistrust the God who has already proven himself trustworthy. Israel had no excuse to mistrust God when he'd already proven himself completely trustworthy in saving them. And that's the same for us, actually. We're in the same boat, but even more so because God has proven himself completely trustworthy to us by saving us not from just hunger and thirst, but from the greatest problem imaginable that we face, which is our own sin. He has saved us from that, our greatest problem, and so we can and ought to trust him in everything, no matter the circumstance, even in our wilderness. So as Paul said, these things all took place as examples for us that we might not desire evil as they did. And so we're just going to breeze through these here. To that end, here are three ways I think that we can learn from Israel's bad example and do better. So firstly, don't forget what your slavery to sin was actually like. This is a fatal mistake that Israel makes. They keep longing to go back to Egypt, and they keep forgetting about the oppressive situation, the mire that they were in. They were being put to death. And they only want to go back because they forget how bad it was. And that, we have to be careful about that. When we're Christians for a long time, we can take it for granted. And we can forget how bad the sin was that God saved us out of. So my encouragement to you is to remember the pain that was your alcoholism or pornography addiction or pride or anger or whatever it was that God has saved you from. Remember that pain that it caused you and caused others. When we're struggling in the wilderness, we ought to remember that being with God in the wilderness is infinitely better than being in the hell that we were in before without him. Secondly, memorialize your salvation. We see memorials all over the place in Exodus, including in chapter 16, which we didn't touch on. And I think that there's just something to this idea of having something outside of your mere memory to call to mind your salvation or something that God has saved you from. So maybe it's a tattoo. Hey, I don't know. It's pretty permanent, but something a little less permanent, maybe some wall art. You can change that out when it's not as fashionable. Or how's about this? Even easier, a cell phone background. You look at that sucker like 50 times a day, don't you? All right, so I do too. different ways that we can put something in front of our faces to help us remember and not forget. And lastly, this is one of something to know, all right? Know that if you have trusted God to take care of your sin problem, then it only makes sense for you to entrust him with your lesser problems too. See, Israel fails to trust God to provide water and food for them, even though God had already revealed himself to be completely trustworthy by saving them out of Egypt. And so their mistrust is really just illogical, like it's irrational. It's not reasonable. And it's simply this, it's that if we can trust God with the big things, then we can trust God with the little things, can't we? It makes sense, right? And so for us, the biggest problem that we have is our sin. And if you trust that God is taking care of your sin problem for forever, which is that's what we claim as Christians, then you have no reason, then I have no reason to not trust him with any lesser problem that we may have, no matter how bad it seems. Everything is less of a problem than our sin, and God has taken care of that. So we can trust him daily with everything. And we don't have to be like Israel, mistrusting grumblers in the wilderness. We can really learn from them. We're just going to close now with a bit of good news. Jesus went through the wilderness, and all three of the Gospels record this, and we see that he's tempted, he's tested by the devil in the wilderness, similar to how Israel's tested, but by God in the wilderness. And what we see is that here's some comfort there, is that, first of all, Jesus understands wilderness because he chose to go there on our behalf. But Jesus also, when he was in the wilderness, he succeeded in the wilderness in ways that we in Israel don't. We fail to trust God, and Jesus did not, but completely depended on his Father. So wherever Israel and we have failed in the wilderness, Jesus was victorious on our behalf. And his victory, his righteousness, is ours as well. Now, I was going to end it there, and then when I made this outline, I realized this isn't the right way to end this. Jesus in the wilderness, yes, it's good news. But here's the final good word for you all. It's a blessing for all of us. It's that wilderness is not the end. It's for now. It's the journey. We need it. We're going through it. But heaven, the promised land, our eternal rest in God, is the end which awaits us. All right, if you just pray with me, and then